I bought my mountain cabin, and my daughter-in-law said, "Get rooms ready, food for 22 people." The key to my dream home had been in my hand for less than 24 hours when my daughter-in-law called to turn it into a hotel for 22 strangers. She thought she was giving me an order. She had no idea she was declaring war. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The silence was the first thing I'd bought. Not with money, but with 9 years of scrimping and saving, of grading papers late into the night until my eyes burned, of turning down summer vacations with friends. That silence, deep and pure as the mountain air, was my first true luxury. Here, in my cabin nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the stone hearth and the soft hiss of the first snowflakes melting against the window pane. It was just past 9 o'clock in the evening. I held a warm mug of tea in my hands, my fingers tracing the rim, and watched my own reflection in the dark glass. A woman of 72, finally at peace. Then the phone rang. Its shrill cry tore through the quiet, an alien sound in this wooden sanctuary. I flinched, spilling a little tea on the worn armchair. My son, Nathan, was the only one who had this number. I set my mug down, my heart thumping with a sudden, nameless dread. But it wasn't Nathan's voice that greeted me. It was his wife's, Cynthia. Her tone was clipped, polished, and utterly devoid of warmth, like ice cubes clinking in a crystal glass. "Marjorie? Good. You picked up." There was no hello, no how are you, no how's the new cabin, just the immediate assumption of my availability. "Cynthia," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hand. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect. Listen, I need you to do something for me. Get the rooms ready, and you'll need to prepare food for 22 people. We're on our way up now. It's for an important event." I went completely still. The fire crackled, oblivious. Outside, the wind howled, as if in protest. 22 people. The words echoed in the cavernous silence of my mind. This cabin had 3 bedrooms. It was my home, my fortress of solitude, not a roadside inn. I could feel the key in my pocket, the one the realtor had handed me just yesterday afternoon. Its edges were still sharp, unfamiliar. It hadn't even had time to warm to my touch. "Cynthia," I started, trying to keep my voice reasonable. I don't have room for 22 people. I don't have food for that many. I only just moved in." A sigh of exasperation traveled down the line, a sound I knew all too well. It was the sound she made when I was being difficult, slow, or simply in her way. "Don't be dramatic, Marjorie. They're investors. This is critical for Nathan's future, our future. Just make it work. We'll be there in about 3 hours." And then the line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, the dial tone a dull buzz in my ear. The call was a block of ice thrown into the tranquil lake of my new life, and the ripples were spreading fast, chilling me to the bone. Shock was the first wave. Then came the familiar sting of being dismissed, of my dreams and my comfort being treated as a mere inconvenience. I walked to the window and looked past my own reflection, out into the swirling snow. The darkness was absolute, swallowing the light from my cabin just a few feet from the porch. They were coming, an army of 22, led by my daughter-in-law, to invade my peace. The shock receded, and in its place, something else began to rise. It was cold, hard, and heavy, like a stone forming in my chest. It was resolve. I looked back at my reflection in the glass, at the shadow I cast on the log wall behind me. It wasn't the shadow of a frail, retired schoolteacher. It was taller, somehow, stronger. A slow smile touched my lips, one that didn't reach my eyes. "All right, Cynthia," I whispered to the howling wind. You can come, but this is my mountain. The sun rose the next morning with a quiet defiance, as if it had no knowledge of the impending invasion. Golden light sliced through the tall pines, striping the wooden floor of my living room. The air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and old books, a perfume I'd waited nearly a decade to breathe. Cynthia's phone call felt like a bad dream, a phantom menace that the daylight should have chased away. But it hadn't. They were still coming. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, the steam warming my face, and decided I would not let them steal this morning from me. This was my first full day in my own home. Come hell or high water, I was going to claim it. I knelt on the floor and sliced open the first of many cardboard boxes marked books. And the scent that rose to meet me was my life story, the dusty, sweet smell of paper and ink. These were not just books, they were milestones. I pulled out a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, its spine soft and creased from years of use. Holding it, I was transported back to my cramped apartment, the lamp on my desk the only light in the room at 2 a.m. I could almost feel the familiar ache in my back and the burn in my eyes from grading stacks of student essays, my red pen flying across the pages. Every checkmark, every correction, was a penny in the jar for this cabin. Next came a slim volume of Robert Frost's poetry. I ran my thumb over the embossed title. This book was the weekend tutoring sessions, the Saturday mornings I gave up for 9 straight years. While my friends were enjoying brunch or going to the farmer's market, I was explaining iambic pentameter to teenagers who would rather be anywhere else. I remembered one boy, so bright but so lost, who finally understood the beauty of The Road Not Taken. The look of discovery on his face had been a deposit into my cabin fund, a payment worth more than the check his parents wrote me. I began to line the shelves, organizing them not by author or genre, but by memory. Each book I placed was a testament to a sacrifice made. A collection of Shakespeare's tragedies represented the old, rattling car I drove for 5 years longer than I should have, praying it would start each winter morning. A thick biography of Marie Curie was the vacation to Italy I turned down, listening to my friends' excited plans with a smile plastered on my face while my heart ached with longing. I told myself that one day I would have a view that rivaled anything in Tuscany. And now, looking out my window at the majestic sweep of the Blue Ridge, I knew I'd been right. This cabin wasn't a gift. It wasn't an inheritance or a lucky break. It was a fortress I had built myself. One graded paper, one missed vacation, one sacrificed weekend at a time. It was the physical manifestation of my own grit. I had earned the right to this peace, to this silence. The thought of Cynthia and her parade of investors descending upon it, treating it like a backdrop for some shallow business deal, made my hands clench. They saw a rustic building. I saw my life's work. I stood back, admiring the first full shelf. The books looked as though they had always been there, their colorful spines a vibrant mosaic against the warm pine of the walls. A feeling of pure, unadulterated happiness washed over me, so potent it almost brought tears to my eyes. This was real. This was mine. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, a shadow of unease crept back in. The peace felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. In a few hours, the first car would turn onto my gravel road. The silence would be broken. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I would have to fight to get it back. This cabin was my trophy, and I wasn't about to let anyone tarnish it. As I stood in my sun-drenched kitchen, the scent of coffee brewing, my mind drifted back to a different kind of gathering. It was a memory I'd tried to bury, but Cynthia's impending arrival had unearthed it with brutal efficiency. The memory was of Christmas 2 years ago, And it was the last time I'd set foot in my son's home. Their apartment was the kind of place featured in magazines, all white walls, sharp angles, and gleaming chrome. It was impeccably clean and breathtakingly expensive, but it had all the warmth of an operating room. Even the Christmas tree looked like a hostage, decorated with perfectly spaced, monochrome ornaments, devoid of any of the handmade, chaotic charm I cherished. We were sitting around a glass dining table that probably cost more than my car. Cynthia, looking flawless in a silk dress, swirled a glass of red wine that was almost the same color. Nathan sat beside her, looking tense, constantly adjusting his tie as if it were choking him. "So, Mom," Nathan had started, trying to fill the awkward silence. "Have you thought more about what you'll do, after you officially retire?" I smiled, feeling a genuine spark of excitement. It was the first time he'd asked. "I have," I said, my voice full of the hope I felt. "I'm saving up. I want to buy a small cabin up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a quiet place with a fireplace and room for all my books." I saw the look that passed between them, a quick, almost imperceptible glance. It was Cynthia who spoke, her voice dripping with a condescending sort of amusement. "A log cabin?" She took a delicate sip of her wine. "You're still dreaming about that? Mom, who even moves to the mountains these days? It's the middle of nowhere. It's peaceful," I said, my smile tightening at the edges. "It's what I've always wanted." She let out a small, tinkling laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just being realistic. Your teacher's pension, well, it probably wouldn't even cover the cost of a fence out there. You should think about a nice condo, something practical. We could even help you find one nearby." Her words were designed to put me in my place, to shrink my dream down to a manageable, sensible size that fit into her world. Every syllable was a pat on the head to a silly old woman. I looked to my son, my only son, hoping for a word of defense, a simple, "Let her dream, Cynthia." He said nothing. He just stared down at his perfectly arranged plate of food, refusing to meet my eyes. He picked up his fork and meticulously cut a piece of asparagus. That silence, that simple act of looking away, was a betrayal far sharper than Cynthia's cruel words. It told me everything I needed to know. He had chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. The familiar feeling of being looked down upon, of being treated as a relic from a bygone era, washed over me. I had felt it many times since Nathan had married her, but this time was different. The hurt was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but beneath it, something else sparked to life. It wasn't sadness. It was a cold, hard ember of anger, an anger that burned with the quiet intensity of a pilot light, waiting for the right moment to roar to life. I took a calm sip of water, placed my napkin on the table, and looked Cynthia directly in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply smiled a tight, private smile. And in the silence of my own mind, I made a promise to myself. A promise that was as solid and real as the mountain I dreamed of. "You'll see," I thought. "One day, you will both see." Now, standing in the kitchen of that very cabin, the dream she'd mocked made real by my own two hands, I felt that ember glow. They thought they were coming here to use my home and walk all over me one more time. They had no idea that for the past 2 years, I hadn't just been saving money. I had been building resolve, and my foundation was rock solid. There was no point in sitting around waiting for the storm to hit. After a quick breakfast, I pulled on my heaviest coat, locked the cabin door behind me, and crunched through the fresh snow to my car. My old Subaru, the one Cynthia hated so much, started up with a reassuring rumble. There was only one person I could talk to about this, one person who would understand the unwritten laws of this mountain. I needed to see Clifford. The drive to his place, a small inn and tavern called the Hidden Nook, took about 20 minutes down the winding mountain road. The snow-laden branches of the pines drooped over the asphalt, creating a silent, white tunnel. It was beautiful, but today, the beauty felt menacing, like a calm before a battle. Clifford's Inn was built from the same dark timber as my cabin, with a wide porch and a curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney. Inside, it was warm and smelled of wood smoke and brewing coffee. The walls were covered in Clifford's own photography, stunning black and white portraits of the mountain in all its moods, and of the faces of the people who lived here, their features as rugged and weathered as the landscape itself. Clifford Hayes was 74, a retired photojournalist with eyes that had seen more of the world than he let on. He was standing behind the heavy oak bar, polishing a glass. He looked up as I came in, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Marjorie," he rumbled, his voice like gravel rolling downhill. "You're out early. Coffee's fresh." "I need more than coffee, Clifford," I said, sliding onto a bar stool. "I need a war council." He put the glass down and leaned on the bar, his smile fading into a look of concern. "That doesn't sound good." I told him everything. I laid out the whole absurd story, the phone call, the demand, the 22 investors, the complete and utter disregard for my home, my peace, my existence. I expected him to be shocked, to offer sympathy, to shake his head at the audacity of it all. Instead, when I finished, he threw his head back and let out a deep, booming laugh that seemed to shake the very rafters of the inn. My jaw dropped. "What's so funny?" He wiped a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. "An army of 22 city slickers, huh? In this weather? Oh, Marjorie, they have no idea what they're getting themselves into." "They're not getting into it, Clifford. I am. They're coming to my house. Cynthia is going to steamroll me." "Not up here, she won't," he said, his laughter subsiding into a knowing grin. He leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Up here, the mountain makes the rules. You just have to know how to use them." He paused, looking out the window at the snow-covered trees. "Don't you worry. The mountain will be on your side. It's high time we let them have a real taste of country life." A spark of hope ignited in my chest. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking they'll be in a hurry," he said, tapping a finger on the bar. "And people in a hurry like shortcuts. I happen to know a shortcut to your place. It's mighty scenic, but after the snow melts and refreezes, well, the road gets a little hungry for fancy cars with city tires." The spark became a flame. "A muddy road?" "The muddiest," he confirmed with a wink. "And you know, the cell service up here is spotty on a good day. The main repeater tower is just up the ridge. Sometimes, especially when the weather gets bad, it needs to take a little break. A man could get lost trying to fix it in a snowstorm." I stared at him, my mind racing. It wasn't just a plan. It was a strategy. A beautiful, elegant, and ruthless strategy. He wasn't just my friend. He was my general. A current of strength shot through me, so powerful it felt like electricity. I was not alone in this. I had an ally, a mountain god in a flannel shirt who knew every rock, every treacherous patch of mud, and every technical vulnerability in a 20-mile radius. I felt a genuine smile spread across my face for the first time since the phone call. The fear and helplessness that had been churning in my stomach evaporated, replaced by the cold, clear focus of a commander before a battle. "Clifford," I said, my voice steady and strong. "Tell me more about this shortcut. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments." Night fell like a thick velvet curtain, snuffing out the last traces of daylight. I had a pot of simple beef stew simmering on the stove and a fire roaring in the hearth, filling the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. I was calm, ready. I was a general waiting in her command tent while the enemy advanced. The first sign of their arrival was a distant glow filtering through the trees. Then came the sound, the low growl of powerful engines, a sound that didn't belong in the deep quiet of the woods. I stepped onto the porch, wrapping my arms around myself against the cold, and watched as a string of headlights pierced the darkness. It wasn't a car. It was a procession. A fleet of gleaming black SUVs and luxury sedans crawling one by one up my narrow, snow-covered trail, looking like a funeral procession for the peace and quiet I had so briefly enjoyed. They parked haphazardly, their tires spinning and spitting gravel. Doors opened, and the forest was suddenly filled with the sound of loud voices, ringing laughter, and the electronic chime of car alarms. 22 people spilled out into the night, a flock of exotic birds suddenly released into a barnyard. They wore cashmere coats and leather boots that were completely unsuitable for the snow. Women in high heels teetered precariously, clutching the arms of men in tailored suits. Cynthia emerged from the lead vehicle, a massive black Escalade, like a queen from her carriage. She was wearing a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment used to be. She scanned the scene, her face a mask of practiced charm. "Everyone welcome," she announced, her voice projecting over the din. "Isn't this just incredible? So rustic." Nathan got out from the passenger side, avoiding my gaze. He looked pale and stressed, his shoulders hunched inside his expensive overcoat. He immediately started directing the unloading of an obscene amount of designer luggage, his movements jerky and anxious. The guests began to file into my cabin, and the small, cozy space was instantly transformed. It became loud, crowded, and suffocating. The air, once filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke, was now thick with a dozen competing expensive perfumes. They moved around the room with a restless energy, touching things, peering at my books, their eyes sweeping over my home as if it were a curious little stage prop. Cynthia took center stage, playing the role of hostess to perfection. "This is Mr. Abernathy, our lead investor from Sterling Corp," she said, guiding a portly man in my direction. "And this is Chloe Vance. You all know her lifestyle blog, of course." She went down the line, introducing a cast of characters who all looked vaguely the same, polished, wealthy, and utterly out of their element. They shook my hand with cool, manicured fingers, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. They offered polite but empty compliments. "What a charming little place," one woman said, her eyes flicking toward the ceiling as if checking for spiders. My cabin, my sanctuary, had become a showroom. I stood by the fireplace, a quiet island in a sea of noise and artificiality, and simply watched. I was a queen in my own castle, observing the clumsy maneuvers of foreign invaders who knew nothing of the land they had just entered. I saw Cynthia pull Nathan aside into the small kitchen alcove. I was close enough to hear her whisper, her voice a sharp, urgent hiss. "Everything depends on tonight, Nathan. This is our last shot. Don't you dare screw it up." Nathan just nodded, his face grim, looking like a man walking to his own execution. He glanced over at me for a fraction of a second, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of desperation, a silent plea. But it was gone as quickly as it came, buried under the weight of his wife's ambition. I turned my attention back to the fire. The logs settled with a soft crackle and a shower of sparks. The guests were loud, confident, and in control. They thought they were the predators here, the sharks in a small pond. They had no idea the water was about to get very, very deep. The next morning, the cabin was a disaster zone of discarded wine glasses and pastry crumbs. The guests emerged from their makeshift sleeping arrangements looking rumpled and irritable. Their city polish had been significantly dulled overnight. Cynthia, however, was already in full command mode, dressed in an impossibly white ski jacket, clapping her hands to rally her troops. "All right, everyone, rise and shine. Today we have a real treat, a guided nature walk to see the famous Laurel Falls," she announced with forced enthusiasm. A collective groan rippled through the room. Right on cue, there was a heavy knock on the door. I opened it to find Clifford, looking every bit the seasoned mountain man in a flannel jacket and a warm beanie. He had a thermos in one hand and a cheerful grin on his face. "Mornin', Marjorie," he said, then tipped his head to the assembled crowd. "Heard you folks were looking for an adventure. The main road to the falls is probably a bit slick today, but I know a shortcut. The views are 10 times better, guaranteed." Cynthia's eyes lit up. This was perfect for her narrative, an exclusive, off-the-beaten-path experience. "A shortcut? How wonderful! Everyone, did you hear that? We're getting the authentic local tour." I watched as the plan clicked perfectly into place. The guests, eager to get this over with, grumbled but followed Cynthia's lead, piling back into their pristine vehicles. Clifford gave me a slow, almost imperceptible wink before climbing into his old pickup truck to lead the way. I stayed behind, promising to have a warm lunch ready for their return. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait. An hour later, I was tidying the living room when I heard the first faint, angry roar of a revving engine echo through the valley. I smiled. The show was beginning. As Clifford later described it to me, the shortcut started innocently enough, a narrow dirt road winding through a beautiful grove of hemlock trees. But as they descended into a low-lying hollow, the ground changed. The thin layer of snow gave way to a thick, soupy mire of red clay mud, courtesy of the melted snow and the freezing rain from the night before. Clifford's truck, with its heavy-duty tires, plowed through it without a problem. The first SUV behind him, a shiny BMW, wasn't so lucky. Its driver, the investor named Abernathy, tried to power through. The sleek tires spun uselessly, just digging the vehicle deeper into the muck, flinging arcs of thick, wet mud all over the car behind it. The engine whined, then stalled. He was dead in the water. One by one, the entire procession came to a halt. They were trapped on a narrow road with no room to turn around. Doors opened, and men in expensive shoes stepped out, immediately sinking ankle-deep into the mire. Curses filled the cold mountain air. It was then that the second shoe dropped. A woman with perfectly styled hair, now looking frantic, pulled out her phone. "It's fine, everyone. I'll just call 8A." She stared at the screen, her brow furrowed in confusion. "That's weird. I have no service." A ripple of unease went through the group. Like a contagion, 21 other phones were pulled from pockets and purses. The verdict was unanimous. Every single screen showed the same two words: no service. The repeater tower, the single lifeline connecting this remote valley to the outside world, had gone silent. The panic began to set in, a quiet, creeping dread at first, then a more vocal, pointed fear. They were stuck in a ditch in the middle of nowhere. Their six-figure cars were useless lumps of metal. Their phones were nothing more than glass and plastic bricks. They were completely and utterly cut off. From my porch, I couldn't see them, but I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The mountain had taken back control. I saw Cynthia, who had been trying to project an air of calm authority, finally lose her composure. Her voice, usually so controlled, was shrill with panic as she yelled at Nathan to do something. The faces of her prized investors, once smug and condescending, were now masks of mud-splattered disbelief and raw, undisguised fear. The queen and her court had just become prisoners of the wilderness. They straggled back to the cabin nearly 2 hours later, a defeated army retreating from a battle they never knew they were fighting. They were cold, mud-caked, and stripped of every last shred of their urban arrogance. The women's expensive hairstyles were ruined, the men's tailored suits were stained, and every face wore the same expression of weary disbelief. They collapsed onto my furniture without asking, their energy completely spent. The cabin, which had felt suffocatingly crowded the night before, now felt like a sanctuary, a lone bastion of warmth and light against the hostile wilderness they had just faced. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional chattering of teeth. The power dynamic had been shattered, and no one knew the new rules. Cynthia paced back and forth in front of the hearth, her white ski jacket now streaked with mud. She was trying desperately to project an image of control, but the frantic, jerky movements gave her away. "Okay, everyone," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too bright. "Let's not panic. This is just a temporary setback. An adventure. We'll have a story to tell." No one looked convinced. The investor, Abernathy, glared at her from his seat on my sofa. "An adventure? My $200,000 car is currently sinking into a bog, Cynthia. I'm not in the mood for stories." The atmosphere was turning ugly. Before a full-blown mutiny could erupt, I stepped forward. "Dinner is ready," I announced quietly. All eyes turned to me. I moved to the stove and lifted the lid off the heavy cast-iron pot. The simple, hearty aroma of beef stew, potatoes, and wild herbs filled the room. Last night, this meal would have been met with disdain, a quaint, rustic novelty. Tonight, it was a lifeline. I began ladling the stew into the mismatched bowls I'd collected over the years. Cynthia watched me, a flicker of her old condescension returning. "Is this it?" she asked, gesturing at the pot. "Just stew?" The question hung in the air, utterly absurd in its context. The lifestyle blogger, Chloe, who had been shivering under a blanket, answered before I could. "It's hot food, Cynthia. At this point, I'd eat the damn blanket." The power had shifted. It was no longer about who had the most money or the best connections. It was about who had the essential skills, who could provide warmth, who could provide food. In this room, stripped of all modern conveniences, I was the wealthiest person present. I handed out the bowls, and they took them with a quiet reverence. They ate quickly, hunched over their food like hungry wolves. In the midst of the quiet chaos, I noticed one person who was not like the others. Mr. Hampton, the older gentleman, the successful businessman, was sitting calmly in the armchair by the fire, the one I'd been in when Cynthia first called. He wasn't panicked or irritable. He was observant. He ate his stew slowly, methodically, but his eyes were constantly moving. I watched as he watched me. He saw how I effortlessly added another log to the fire, how I knew exactly where to find extra blankets, how I moved through the cabin with a quiet confidence that came from capability, not arrogance. Then, his gaze would shift to Cynthia. He watched her pacing, her poorly concealed panic, the way she checked her useless phone every 30 seconds. He was watching us like a scientist observing two different species in a new environment. He wasn't a victim of this crisis. He was a student of it. When everyone was finished, I collected the empty bowls. There wasn't a single scrap of food left. The guests were now looking at me with a new kind of respect, a primal understanding of who held the real power. I was no longer just the quaint, elderly mother-in-law. I was the provider. I was the leader. And in the flickering firelight, I saw the truth reflected in their weary faces. My quiet, simple cabin had become my kingdom. As the evening wore on, the initial shock of being stranded gave way to a tense, simmering boredom. The guests, having exhausted their complaints, now sat in sullen silence, staring into the fire or at the dark, unblinking windows. The air was thick with resentment. In an attempt to break the tension, one of the younger investors, a man named Julian, decided he wanted a cigar he'd brought along. "Anyone got a light?" he asked the room at large. A collective search of pockets and purses produced nothing. Lighters, it seemed, were a casualty of the modern age, replaced by the charging ports in their now useless cars. "My wife, Cynthia, she might have one," Nathan offered, his voice sounding small and eager to please. It was a pathetic attempt to restore some semblance of normalcy, to be the helpful host. Cynthia, who was deep in a hushed, intense conversation with Mr. Abernathy, waved a dismissive hand in the direction of her expensive leather handbag, which sat on a side table. "In my purse, Nathan. Just look." Grateful for the task, Nathan scurried over to the bag. It was a ridiculously large, over-designed thing, and he fumbled with the clasp before plunging his hand into its chaotic interior. He rummaged past a wallet, a phone, a mess of cosmetics, and a set of keys. His fingers brushed against something stiff and rectangular. As he tried to pull his hand out, the object came with it, slipping from his grasp and falling silently onto the thick rug at his feet. It was a slim, unmarked manila folder. He bent to pick it up, intending to shove it back into the bag unseen, but it had fallen open, and under the warm lamplight, a single line of text at the top of the first page caught his eye. It was the name of a tech startup, Innovate Dynamics. His blood ran cold. He froze, crouching there on the floor, the folder in his hands. Innovate Dynamics was the company he had sunk his entire inheritance into 18 months ago. A sure thing, Cynthia had called it. She'd gotten a hot tip, an inside track from a trusted source. He'd trusted her, emptied his accounts, and watched in horror as the company declared bankruptcy less than 6 months later, taking every penny with it. It was the source of their biggest fights, the debt that hung over their marriage like a guillotine, the failure she never let him forget. His hands shaking, he flipped to the next page. It was a detailed report. He saw dates, transaction records, and a name he recognized: Cynthia's most ruthless business rival. The report outlined, in cold corporate language, how a stream of fabricated insider information about Innovate Dynamics had been strategically leaked. A trap designed to financially cripple a competitor's associates. A trap he had walked right into. He felt the air leave his lungs, a silent, crushing blow. She hadn't been given a bad tip. She had fed him to the wolves to settle a score. But the worst was yet to come. He turned the final page, and a name jumped out at him that made his heart stop altogether: Hampton Industries. The document was a prospectus, detailing how Hampton's massive corporation had been planning to acquire and liquidate Innovate Dynamics for months, waiting for its value to hit rock bottom. The company he had invested in, the source of his financial ruin, was nothing more than a footnote on a balance sheet for the very man sitting calmly by the fire, watching them all. The rug was pulled out from under him. The entire narrative of his life for the past 2 years, his failure, his debt, his inadequacy, was a lie. He wasn't a failed investor. He was a pawn, a casualty, a sacrifice his own wife had willingly placed on the altar of her ambition, and a piece of collateral damage in a corporate game being played by the man in the armchair. He slowly rose to his feet, the thin folder feeling as heavy as a tombstone in his hands. The years of meekness, of apologizing for things that weren't his fault, of walking on eggshells around her explosive temper, all of it evaporated in a single, searing moment of clarity. He looked across the room at Cynthia. She was still smiling her plastic smile at Abernathy, completely unaware. He didn't see his wife anymore. He saw a stranger, a predator who had gutted him and left him to bleed, all while telling him the wound was his own fault. The fear he had lived with for so long was gone, burned away by a feeling so pure and cold it terrified him: disgust. The silence in the cabin had become a physical presence. It was a heavy blanket smothering the last embers of conversation. The 22 guests, who had arrived as a confident pack, were now a collection of isolated, anxious individuals. They stared at their empty bowls, at the fire, at anything but each other. Nathan stood frozen near the side table, the manila folder clutched in his hand like a damning verdict, his face a pale mask of shock and fury. Cynthia, oblivious, was still trying to salvage her deal with Abernathy, her voice a low, desperate murmur. It was Mr. Hampton who finally broke the spell. He set his empty bowl aside, cleared his throat, and the small sound made everyone jump. "You know," he began, his voice calm and resonant, filling the quiet room. "This situation, being cut off like this, it reminds me of something from a long time ago." All eyes turned to him. In a room full of people desperate for a distraction, a story was a welcome gift. "It was 1975, he continued, looking into the flames as if the memory were playing out there. "I was a boy, not much older than 15. My family didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. I was smart, but I was angry. Angry at the world. I was all set to drop out of high school and go work at the mill. Seemed like my only option." He paused, letting the image settle. "But there was this one teacher, an English teacher. She was young, barely making enough to get by herself. But she saw something in me that I couldn't see. She saw potential where I only saw a dead end. She started staying after school with me, tutoring me for free. When I told her I couldn't afford the books we were supposed to be reading, she'd show up the next day with a used copy she'd bought with her own money. She told me I wasn't destined for the mill. She told me I was destined for a university." He smiled a small, genuine smile. "When the time came to apply for scholarships, I refused. I told her it was pointless, that a kid like me would never get one. The next day, she came to my house. She sat at our rickety kitchen table with my mother and me, and she filled out the application herself. She even paid the application fee out of her own purse." Abernathy and the others were leaning forward now, captivated. It was a classic rags to riches story, the kind they all loved. "I got the scholarship," Hampton said quietly. "A full ride. It changed the entire course of my life. That single act of kindness was the foundation everything else was built on." He finally looked away from the fire, his gaze sweeping across the room until it landed on me. His eyes were filled with a deep, profound respect. "That teacher," he said, his voice clear and strong, "was Mrs. Marjorie Callahan." A collective gasp went through the room. All heads swiveled in my direction. I sat there, stunned into silence by the sudden revelation. The memory of a skinny, angry boy with brilliant eyes flooding back to me after all these years. Then just as quickly, Hampton's demeanor shifted. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a chilling coldness. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, until his gaze was locked directly on Cynthia. The air crackled with tension. "I learned a valuable lesson from my teacher," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every word was as sharp and clear as a shard of ice. "The most important lesson of all, that the only foundation worth building on, whether it's for a life or for a business, is one built on truth." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Not one built on flashy promises made to desperate investors." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a courtroom after the guilty verdict has been read. Every single person in that room, from the investors to the blogger to Nathan, understood the implication. The unspoken accusation was deafening. Cynthia's face went completely white, as if all the blood had drained from it. Her carefully constructed world, her entire charade, had just been demolished by a single, perfectly aimed sentence. The play was over. Mr. Hampton's words fell into the silence like stones into a deep well, the ripples spreading to every corner of the room. Cynthia stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief. For a moment, I thought she might actually shatter. But I had underestimated the feral tenacity of a cornered animal. The shock on her face hardened, twisting into a venomous sneer. She was going down, and she was determined to take someone with her. She turned, her eyes locking onto her husband. Nathan was still standing by the table, the folder in his hands, his knuckles white. He was her last weapon, her final scapegoat. "Don't you all listen to him," she spat, her voice sharp and brittle. She pointed a trembling finger at Nathan. "Ask him. Ask my husband about foundations built on lies. He owes me an explanation and a very, very large sum of money." Her voice dripped with contempt, a calculated performance for her audience of investors. She was painting him as the villain, the deadbeat, the source of all her problems. It was a move she had perfected over years of private arguments and public humiliations. It had always worked. It had always made him shrink, apologize, and retreat. But not this time. Something inside Nathan had fundamentally broken and been rebuilt in the last 10 minutes. The man who straightened his shoulders and met her gaze was not the man who had arrived at my cabin the night before. His fear was gone, replaced by a righteous fury that was terrifying in its stillness. "A debt?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He took a step forward, then another. "You want to talk about debt, Cynthia?" He walked to the center of the room, right into the circle of stunned onlookers. And with a flick of his wrist, he threw the manila folder onto the rough-hewn coffee table. It landed with a soft, definitive slap that echoed louder than a gunshot in the silent room. "This debt?" he roared, the sound ripping from his throat, raw and full of pain. "The debt you manufactured? The debt you saddled me with when you fed me a lie to ruin a business rival?" He jabbed a finger at the folder. "It's all in there. The fake tip, the setup, everything." He finally looked at her, and the look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated loathing. "You didn't just let me fail, Cynthia. You orchestrated it. You destroyed me to get ahead." The room erupted in a cacophony of gasps and shocked murmurs. The investors stared, first at the folder, then at Cynthia, their faces a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. They weren't just witnessing a marital spat. They were witnessing the public execution of a business deal and the unmasking of a fraud. Cynthia stared at the folder, then back at Nathan, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, but no sound came out. The blood drained from her face, leaving it a waxy, pale yellow. Her mask of control had not just slipped. It had been violently torn away, revealing the desperate, ugly truth beneath. Nathan wasn't finished. He turned to Mr. Hampton, who had been watching the entire exchange with the calm, detached interest of a chess master watching his opponent fall into a well-laid trap. "And you," Nathan said, his voice shaking but strong. "Hampton Industries. You were waiting in the wings the whole time, ready to pick the bones of the company I'd been tricked into investing in." The second secret was now out in the open, laid bare for everyone to see. The investors looked at each other, their expressions hardening. They were sharks who had just realized they were swimming with an even bigger shark, and that the entire venture they'd been pitched was built on a foundation of lies, betrayal, and corporate sabotage. In that moment, Cynthia's collapse was total. She had lost her investors. She had lost her husband. She had lost her dignity. She stood alone in the center of my cabin, exposed and utterly powerless, a queen without a kingdom, a con artist whose final con had spectacularly imploded. The fire Clifford had helped me build earlier now blazed in a stone pit a few yards from the cabin, a circle of warmth and light under a vast, star-dusted sky. No one had suggested it, but the group had migrated outside, as if the cabin's walls could no longer contain the explosive tension. They stood around the flames, not for camaraderie, but like moths drawn to a light in the disorienting darkness. They were a jury now, and Cynthia was in the dock. The investors, who hours ago had been her prized assets, now looked at her with the cold, appraising eyes of men who have been swindled. They kept their distance, their body language a clear wall of rejection. Mr. Abernathy, whose BMW was still nose down in the mud, spoke first, his voice a low growl of contempt. So this entire weekend, this exclusive retreat, was a lie. You brought us up here on a false pretense to pitch a deal that was already rotten to the core. Cynthia flinched but said nothing. She had no defense left. Mr. Hampton, who had been silently observing, stepped forward. The firelight carved sharp, predatory lines onto his face. He was no longer the benevolent benefactor from a long-ago memory. He was the CEO, the hunter, moving in for the kill. My interest, and the interest of my firm, is officially withdrawn, he announced, his voice cutting through the cold night air. There was no emotion in it, just the finality of a judge's gavel. Furthermore, in light of Mr. Callahan's testimony, Hampton Industries will be launching a full internal investigation into the source of the market manipulation that targeted him. We have a zero-tolerance policy for such fraudulent activities. He was washing his hands of the whole affair, positioning himself as a champion of ethics while simultaneously twisting the knife. He let that sink in, then delivered the coup de grâce. He looked directly at Cynthia, his expression devoid of pity. However, your company is now in a uniquely vulnerable position. It is over-leveraged, its reputation is about to be non-existent, and its leadership is compromised. He paused. I am prepared, as a gesture of goodwill to mitigate further market damage, to make you an offer. Hampton Industries will acquire your company's assets to absolve its debts. We'll offer you 10 cents on the dollar. A wave of shocked murmurs went through the investors. It was a brutal, insulting, rock-bottom offer. It wasn't a rescue. It was a public dissection. He was offering to buy her entire life's work for pennies, right in front of the very people she had tried so desperately to impress. This was the final blow. A sound escaped Cynthia's throat, a choked, wounded gasp. She had lost everything. The money was gone. Her reputation was in ashes. Her allies had become her accusers. And then she lost the last thing she had. Nathan, who had been standing silently by the fire, watching his life burn down and be reborn, took a deep breath. He walked away from the circle of investors, his steps sure and steady on the frozen ground. He walked past his wife, not even giving her a glance. He came to stand beside me, his shoulder brushing against mine. He looked out at the group, at the men who had witnessed his deepest humiliation and his ultimate liberation. I'm staying here, he said, his voice clear and unwavering. I'm staying with my mother. It was a simple declaration, but it was the most powerful statement of the night. It was an abdication of his old life and an acceptance of a new one. In that moment, the last thread connecting him to Cynthia was severed. The judgment of the mountain was complete. The other guests, as if on some silent signal, turned their backs on Cynthia. They shuffled closer to the fire, closer to the warmth, leaving her standing alone in the cold darkness just outside the circle of light. She was an outcast, utterly and completely alone, with nothing but the vast, indifferent wilderness at her back. 6 months passed. The snows of that chaotic winter melted, feeding the mountain streams and coaxing a riot of green from the forest floor. Summer arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains, not with a roar, but with a gentle, warm sigh. The air was now thick with the scent of honeysuckle and damp earth, and the silence was a living thing, filled with the drone of bees and the lazy chirping of cicadas. I was sitting on my front porch in my favorite rocking chair, a well-worn copy of Whitman open on my lap. The sun warmed my face, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the tall oak tree that shaded the cabin. This was the peace I had worked for, the silence I had fought to reclaim. It was deeper and sweeter now, earned through fire. A letter had arrived in the mail that morning, bearing a postmark from a small town just one valley over. It was from Nathan. He wrote to me every week. He had finalized the divorce, a quiet affair with no fight left in Cynthia. He'd taken a job managing a local bookstore, a world away from the high-pressure finance job he'd hated. He wrote about the simple pleasure of recommending a good book to a customer, of walking by the river on his lunch break. He was healing. He was finding his way back to himself, and his letters were filled with a lightness I hadn't heard in his voice in over a decade. He was free. Of Cynthia, there was no word. She had vanished from our lives as completely as a wisp of morning fog burning off in the sun. Her company had been absorbed, her name disgraced. She had flown too close to the sun, and the mountain had simply refused to break her fall. As I was folding Nathan's letter, the mail carrier's truck rumbled up my gravel driveway again. It was unusual to get a second delivery. He handed me a small, heavy box, postmarked from New York City. The return address simply read, Hampton Industries. I took the box inside and sat at my kitchen table, turning it over in my hands. I carefully cut the tape and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet, were 2 items. The first was a fountain pen, a magnificent instrument of polished black lacquer and gleaming silver. It was elegant, expensive, and perfectly balanced. It was a writer's pen. Beneath it was a sealed envelope. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a cashier's check. The number written on it made me gasp. It was an astronomical sum, far more than Nathan had ever lost. A short typewritten note was clipped to it. It read, For damages, and for the first lesson, W. Hampton. I stared at the check, at the long string of zeros. It was a king's ransom. It was the kind of money that could change a life, the kind of money Cynthia had been willing to destroy her own soul for. It was a piece of that other world, that world of power plays and corporate warfare, delivered right to my quiet doorstep. I picked up the pen. It felt cool and solid in my hand. This, I understood. This was a symbol of a debt that had nothing to do with money. It was a message between a student and his teacher, a piece of a shared history. I stood up, walked over to my old wooden desk, and opened a drawer. I placed the check inside, underneath a stack of old photographs. It could stay there. Nathan was building a new life, one that wasn't measured in dollars and cents. He didn't need this, but the pen I kept. I placed it on the desk right beside my reading glasses. Later that afternoon, I took a hammer and a nail and hung a small hand-carved wooden sign I'd been working on next to my front door. The letters were simple and clear. It read, A place of books, memories, and truth. I stepped back and looked at my home, my fortress, my sanctuary. I had everything I had ever wanted. The mountain had tested the invaders, found them wanting, and cast them out. And it had kept its own safe. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.